I find it amusing that regardless of how big our houses are or how fancy our appliances are, that when it comes to our fridges, we all struggle with the very same issue, especially if we have kids. Our refrigerators, they fill up with the artwork and the pictures of our kids. We place them on here. I've got this picture on my refrigerator of my child from VBS. He must have been 5 or 6 years old. He turns 13 in November. I've got another picture of my son playing baseball. It's been at least 3 seasons since he's played. And so I find it interesting. We keep these things on there. They're the things that capture our hearts, things that we hold close to us, things that we care deeply about, things that we hang on there because as we look at these pictures of our children, we have dreams and aspirations, and we have hope. I once heard a pastor talk about, imagine grabbing hold of one of the pictures off the refrigerator and looking at the picture of your child. And as you look at that picture of your child, you think about how many dreams and aspirations that you had for that child. But now that child's grown up, and you still keep pictures on your refrigerator, pictures of when he played baseball or when he played basketball, but he's grown up, and he's not become the child that you had hoped he would be. Now in his adult years, he runs around wrecking the lives of others. And you're in your home, that place where people can't hear your voice. And you're standing in front of the refrigerator and you're holding in your hand that picture of that child that you had dreams and aspirations for. And now reflecting upon what his life has become, your mind processes a thought that you never, ever imagined that you could possibly have. Knowing that your child was right now destroying someone else's life. You look at that picture and you think, I wish I'd never had him. Now you wouldn't admit that to anyone, but it's that internal thought that possesses your heart, that heartbrokenness and grief. Genesis chapter 6. This chapter that for many of us is a great struggle to understand. We find ourselves standing beside God as He stands beside His refrigerator, holding our pictures in His hand. And in his mind, he thinks the thought he thought he'd never have to think. I wish I never made them. Most mornings as you happen by my house, maybe 5:30 in the morning, you'll catch me sitting in this chair, sitting here with the Bible on one knee and my journal on the other. The only sounds at that time are the crickets and the birds and the traffic as it passes by. And in those moments, as I sit here in this chair and I hold the Bible in my hand, what I'm searching for, what I'm looking for, is for God to make sense of the world that I live in. For Him to use this story to speak into my life and to somehow bring certainty, some sort of clarity, some sort of black and white into my very gray world in which I live. I'm looking for that world because I deeply yearn for it. I deeply want someone to make sense of everything that I go through. And you do too. But too often as I read the scriptures, sitting here in those early mornings, God won't cater to my need for certainty. Instead, God challenges me to wrestle with Him. He leaves a lot of edges very fuzzy. And when I read a chapter like Genesis chapter 6, it's a moment like that. A moment when I'm encountering a God that I struggle to make sense of. A God who, in this story, is so deeply affected by my sin and rebellion that His heart is actually broken. Broken to the point where God is willing to be done with the whole world. Now, as I read a passage like that, I'm left with a lot of questions. Questions that the scriptures weren't necessarily designed to answer. Not in this one passage. In order to make sense of this God, I've got to wrestle with the entirety of the scriptures. This gives me a picture, a portrait of a moment in the life of God, in the life of humanity. And so I wrestle. I wrestle to try to make sense of all that I find in that passage. Passage of a God who speaks the unspeakable. A passage of God who's preparing himself to do the undoable. A passage that somehow places me wrestling with his nature, with my rebellion, and with our responsibility. Reading the scriptures is sometimes like standing in a forest. There are these clearings, but these clearings are oftentimes surrounded by brush. And too often I think what happens is we are so determined to make sense of the brush that we miss the clearings. And so what I'm going to challenge you to do as you read Genesis chapter 6 and 7 is to step back in a moment in the clearing and allow the brush, the edges, to remain unclear, uncut, unfinished. When I look at the story of Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 7, I encounter the story of human rebellion. One that begins in a garden, but by the time we reach Genesis 6, is so thorough and so rich that it has contaminated every bit of who we are. It says that the inclinations of our hearts and minds are only evil all the time. And another word for that is actually our imagination. So we are only able to imagine evil. What this story does is refuse to place the culpability of that on God. It makes us responsible, solely responsible for our own evil. Do I know the answers of how much God knew about what could happen and what would happen? No, I don't. But what I do know as I read this story, as I stand in the clearing, is that I am ultimately responsible for that sin and for that evil and for that rebellion. As I continue to read through the story, I encounter the story of a God he's just about to be done with the world. He's tired, he's wore out of our rebellion, and he's not going to let things remain as they are. And yet this God of anger, this God of frustration, this God of wrath, at the moment he's just about to wipe out the world, he looks and says, "Oh, but wait! I love them. I love them deeply. I care about them." And I see one, a man named Noah, a man whose story is marginal. We don't know much about him, only that he was righteous in a land of perversion. He doesn't even get a line in the story, folks. But there he says, I've got one, and I'm going to start with him and his family. And in this midst of this chaos and destruction that I'm preparing to bring, I'm going to rescue he and his family. I'm going to create a space of grace in the midst of the ocean of chaos. See, God was the God who'd boundaried chaos. He'd set the borders of chaos and said, you can come this far and no further. And now God is saying, I'm withdrawing my hands. Chaos is going to consume. But in the midst of that chaos, there's going to be this one space of grace. A space where you'll be safe. And you will float on the waters of chaos. And I will hold you fast. And I will begin through you. Grace shows up, even in a story of wrath, even in a story of anger, because God's holy love continually compels him to reach out, to reconcile, to redeem. So much about this story disturbs me. It's not a cute story that you put pictures of in your nurseries at home. This is the story of death, the story of screams that are no longer, the story of pounding on the side of an ark until you can't hear that pounding any longer. But there, in this space of grace, in this box without a rudder, God protects and he preserves this family. Now, we began by telling the story of how our sin was when we seized that master remote controller in chapter 3 and the devastation that caused. But now God has placed Noah and his family on this water of chaos, in this box without a rudder, and they are no longer in control, only floating, only waiting, only being still and trusting that the one who called them into salvation was the one who would bring it to pass. As I lean into this story of Genesis chapter 6 and 7, a story that has so much brush and so many fuzzy edges, I find these clearings along the way. Clearings that point me to a hope that though we are culpable for sin and evil in this world, and though God will deal with that sin and evil, God is this God of love and grace who makes space in the sea of chaos for us to live and trust and wait on him. It's that clearing that points me towards hope. But we'll deal more with that in chapters 8 and 9 of Genesis. There are times when as we read stories, like Genesis chapters 6 and 7, we find ourselves feeling very much like the inhabitants of that box without a rudder, floating on the waters with really no sense of clarity on what this is going to look like or how this is going to end up. What I find interesting about this story is that Noah and his family don't at any point demand God answer all their questions before they get on the boat. Instead, they hear that voice. They hear that call. They cooperate in building the space of grace. They get in the ship. They trust. They float. They wait. And they have faith that the God who called them into that place of grace is the God who will see them through it. As you wrestle with this story, do as Noah's family did. Don't stand on the outside of the boat demanding clarity. Instead, step into that clear spot, that spot of grace, that spot prepared for you. Bring your questions, bring your doubts, bring your worries, but get in the boat, get in the box, get in this rudderless box. Trust, wait, float, be still, and know that He's God. And trust that the God who revealed Himself in grace will make the trajectory of your life and His grace for your life clear as you live it with Him.